Within the first 3 months of 2001, the professional wrestling landscape completely changed forever. First, Extreme Championship Wrestling, the perceived number 3 promotion in America, went out of business with a whimper. Not long after that, World Championship Wrestling threw in the towel, with WWE head honcho Vince McMahon more than happy to swoop in and purchase his closest competition for a snip. Just like that, there was now only one game in town, just one product for fans to watch and one place for wrestlers to work, if they wanted to be on television and make a good living anyway. And while there would be many ultra-violent imitators seeking to fill that void left by the death of ECW, only one promotion decided to go the family-friendly route, using recognizable stars from the past and a handful of promising upstarts in their bid to make a mark on the industry. The XWF was ultimately not a success, but just how it came to be and exactly why it failed to get off the ground is in itself an interesting story that offers insight into the wrestling business during a very critical period. No more prima donnas, no more politics, in your face. That was the promotion's catchphrase. They used to say it all the time. I'm Jack from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is the true story of the XWF. Join us. When WCW closed its doors on March 26, 2001, WWE acquired the contracts of 24 wrestlers, most of whom were lower card performers. The major stars, however, had large guaranteed contracts with WCW's parent company Time Warner and were under no obligation to accept a buyout and join WWE. The likes of Sting, Goldberg, and Kevin Nash, for example, could and would happily sit at home for the remainder of their deals and make a mint for doing nothing. For the wrestlers who either weren't picked up by WWE or didn't have a cushy contract to pay the bills, their options were limited to either domestic and international indies or a spot touring with one of the Japanese organizations, but those spots were quite hard to come by at the time. It was Brian Knobbs, one half of the Nasty Boys tag team, that first brought up the idea of securing funding, getting the band back together, and creating a place for people to work. At the same time, Knobbs' close friend, Hulk Hogan, had been in conversations with Universal for months, though it wasn't known just exactly what sort of venture they were having these meetings about. Some speculated that it was just to do with a restaurant and a separate attraction at Universal's resort. And I, for one, will be first in line for Pastamania the Ride. Anyway, Hogan being in negotiations caused a slight issue in early May of 2001 when Eric Bischoff went to Universal trying to secure funding for the Matrats project. For those unaware, Matrats was a Calgary-based promotion that consisted of wrestlers between the ages of 14 and 21 performing innovative high-risk moves in a ring that had small platforms attached to the ring posts. Young up-and-comers like Jack Evans and Teddy Hart were attached to the project, with Bischoff and business partner Jason Hervey coming on board to help find distribution. And when Eazy-E met with Universal, he name-dropped Hogan as someone who may be involved, causing them to question whether the Hulkster would be involved with another wrestling league they may have already discussed with him. In early June, it was reported that Universal and Hogan were trying to get together a 1-hour television pilot centered around Hogan versus someone, as well as appearances by non-wrestling celebrities to be filmed at Universal Studios in Orlando. The tentative date for the taping was scheduled for August 8th, and some wrestlers began cutting promos for it. This included Emery Hale, an absolute giant of a man who had wrestled a dozen matches for WCW as Hale, where he was managed by Jimmy Hart. Hale was thought to be the big monster heel being groomed for a main event spot against Hogan. As for Jimmy Hart, he was hard at work contacting other wrestlers to be part of a pilot. There was enough interest in the project initially that an executive from the Fox network asked to be given the first opportunity to review the pilot. Other wrestlers rumored for the taping included Bret Hart and Roddy Piper, while Hogan's celebrity pals Jay Leno, George Foreman, and Shaquille O'Neal were being considered for cameo appearances. Hogan continued to negotiate with Universal via his lawyer Henry Holmes throughout June. Universal, meanwhile, had become concerned with the risque tone of recent WWE programming and wanted assurances that there would be no scantily clad women or profanity on this pilot episode. And this wasn't a problem because Hogan's crew had no desire to go in that direction. They also had no real desire to be true competition for Vince McMahon because they knew that would be borderline impossible without a magic money tree. In July, there were rumblings that Jerry the King Lawler, who had quit WWE in protest after they fired his wife Stacey Carter, aka The Cat, in February, would make the would-be promotion his new home. Later that month, though, it became apparent that the promotion would not be taping its pilot on August 8th, and that things between Hogan's camp and Universal were on hold for the time being. Hogan then gave an interview to a local newspaper in Barrie, Ontario, while doing a celebrity golf tournament with Jimmy Hart, and he said that the new promotion was a way for his career to end in a logical way. Remember, this is about a year on from the infamous Bash at the Beach 2000 fiasco, which was the last time anyone had seen Hogan in a wrestling ring. He also expressed his hope that Piper and Brett would be part of it, and said that Vince McMahon would be better off paying him $50 million a year not to go against him, which is kind of some textbook Hulk Hogan waffle, you have to say. During an interview on Bubba the Love Sponge's radio show around the same time, Hogan was very complimentary of perennial frenemy Randy Savage, but did concede that his group wouldn't be able to afford Goldberg given what he was being paid on his Time Warner deal to sit out. So there were big names being talked about, but on July 24th, however, Hogan claimed that he'd put all plans for a promotion on hold for at least 6 months, citing a lack of interest among the major television networks. Days prior, Hogan's representatives were still talking to people within wrestling and giving details about the company and who would be involved. Those who had spoken to Hogan's representatives said the key players would be Hogan, Jimmy Hart, Sting once his Time Warner deal expired in early 2002, Bret Hart, Roddy Piper, Kevin Sullivan, Sable, and Chyna when they were legally available. Another stumbling block, besides a perceived lack of network interest, was Hogan's ongoing defamation of character lawsuit against Time Warner and Vince Russo, stemming from that aforementioned incident at Bash at the Beach 2000. Some close to the situation, though, also felt like Hogan actually had one eye on a WWE comeback. Hogan, who was recovering from a minor knee surgery, touched base with Bischoff in mid-September to see if there was anything positive about starting something up on his end. Bischoff advised Hogan that everything was pretty much dead in the water since a promotion couldn't be sustained without TV and nobody he had met had showed any interest. Shortly after that conversation, however, news emerged that a deal had indeed been signed and funding was in place for a new promotion that would tape at Universal Studios. But Hulk Hogan wouldn't be involved. It seemed that Hogan had pulled out of negotiations, paving the way for Jimmy Hart and Brian Knobbs to take over. Joining them would be David Penza and Janie Engel, who worked in WCW's Talent Relations Department, and they would work in a newly opened office in Tampa, with Kevin Sullivan helping with the booking and Greg Valentine enlisted as a trainer. The idea presented to wrestlers contacted in late September to work the tapings on November 13th and 14th was to record a 2-hour pilot along with 8 one-hour shows for syndication. Talent would, at least initially, just be signed for those 2 dates. The word on the street was that the money offered was a decent amount given the general climate at the time. It was also reported that the as yet unnamed promotion was already in talks for foreign syndication deals but had no significant leads on the domestic front. Clearly, though, there was some serious money behind this startup, money which, it turns out, came from a somewhat unlikely source. Kevin Harrington, who had made a fortune as the person responsible for the As Seen on TV infomercials, was the man with deep pockets who originally got on board.
Harrington then used his connections to get other investors involved, like fellow infomercial magnates Walter Frank and Ludwig Denny.
Despite the cash available, the odds were very much against the XWF. It had a lot of buzz for a startup, but without cable television, industry insiders suspected that the promotion would be short-lived and unprofitable. As well as buzz from fans and those within the industry's leader was keeping a close eye on developments. WWE were just getting used to this whole no competition thing and didn't really want to see anyone cut into their market share. One person who would not be along for the XWF ride was Bret Hart, who told Knobbs that he didn't want to be involved in a new promotion if he couldn't actually wrestle. Randy Savage, on the other hand, could wrestle, but his demands were said to be exorbitant and discussions didn't progress beyond the initial stages. Hogan and Mean Gene Okerlund met with the promotion in early October as Tony Schiavone and Jerry Lawler were locked in as the announced duo. The XWF were also speaking with Ric Flair, who was one of the many collecting on his Time Warner deal. But XWF officials told the Nature Boy that they were willing to buy out his contract and were interested in running another program between him and Hulk Hogan. The Hulkster officially confirmed his participation on October 25th when he called into Bubba the Love Sponge's radio show, and of course, it wouldn't be a Hogan media appearance without him spouting some bollocks, would it? Hogan claimed to Bubba that he would be the majority owner of the XWF and would deal with talent directly, but in reality, Hogan had zero ownership stake in the XWF, and he was only planned to work a few special matches for the promotion per year. Hogan also mentioned some talent that would be involved at the inaugural tapings, naming Vampiro, Curt Hennig, the Nasty Boys, Disorderly Conduct, the Shane Twins, the Harris Brothers, and Josh Matthews. That Josh Matthews, yes, fresh from Tough Enough. On top of the television tapings, reports at the time suggested that XWF and Universal had also reached an agreement for the promotion to run events 3 times a week as a park attraction at Universal Studios, but this wouldn't end up happening. XWF management, meanwhile, had their sights set on future house show tours. So these were somewhat grand plans, basically, as the project continued to gather momentum. It would certainly be a shame, wouldn't it, if their biggest draw, the first batch of TV tapings was going to be entirely built around, suddenly backed out just days before the cameras started rolling. That would be a shame now, wouldn't it, brother? Hulk Hogan pulled out of the inaugural tapings on November 9th, telling friends that he did so because he had insurance concerns. According to Hogan, since the promotion was going to be marketed as Hulk Hogan's XWF, with red and yellow ring ropes and him positioned as an on-air figurehead, his lawyers told him that any issues could potentially fall back, therefore, on him. But others close to the situation questioned whether this was actually the reason and suggested that the issues were probably more likely to do with money. Hogan reportedly wanted a $2 million contract with $50,000 paid up front, and well, that just wasn't really going to happen now, was it? Hogan did show up to the first taping on November 13th as an act of goodwill to Hart and Knobs, helping out backstage and recording a promo wishing the promotion well. As for who was scheduled for those to perform at the initial set of tapings, XWF really weren't hurting in terms of recognizable names. They had quite a collection. Roddy Piper, Rena Miro, the Nasty Boys, the Road Warriors, Jim Duggan, Vampiro, Buff Bagwell, Jerry Lawler, Jimmy Hart, Conan, Greg Valentine, Juventud Guerrera, Psychosis, Kid Cash, Mark Miro, Barbarian, and Norman Smiley were just some of those with name value, while stars of the future like AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels were also on hand. John Earthquake Tenta and Bam Bam Bigelow were also at the tapings, but they were ultimately not used. The first day of tapings was described as resembling kind of like WCW circa 94-95, with the main story coming out of them that Rena Miro was named Kayfabe CEO and Roddy Piper as commissioner. Wrestlers who performed were said to be very happy with the laid-back atmosphere of the tapings, which, incidentally, were free to enter for Universal Studios patrons. Those who were told at meetings before the first taping, and then at the taping itself, that Hogan wouldn't be involved with the XWF in the short term were no doubt a bit confused when Terry Bollea put on that iconic red and yellow and worked a match with Curt Hennig on the second day. Hogan beat the former Mr. Perfect in a routine Hogan sort of match, most notable for Bobby Heenan, acting as Hennig's sports agent, taking his first actual bump in about a decade. That match wasn't on the initial run sheet, and Hennig ended up pulling double duty against Mark Miro, with those close to the situation putting it down to Hogan just doing a favor for Jimmy Hart. Pro bono, no less. Whatever the reason, though, Hogan worked his first match since leaving WCW over a year earlier, and was by far, obviously, the most over act at the tapings. After his victory, Hogan vowed that he was coming after the XWF World title. Now, he may have won his match and cut a promo hinting at future participation, but remember, Hogan had definitely not signed a deal with the XWF. Lawler, who provided commentary at the tapings, would also not be back because he inked a deal to return to WWE mere days later. On November 15th, the company held a press conference where they spoke confidently of getting a TV deal to air the 10 episodes they had taped over the previous 2 days. Management had also been telling wrestlers that they expected to do 2 days of TV tapings a month, with the next set in late January, and planned on running around 145 house shows in 2002, with the first ones taking place in December. Those house shows were duly scheduled for December 28th, 29th, and 30th in Hammond, Indiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Green Bay, Wisconsin. The idea was to push the shows via 30-minute infomercials in the local markets. The top stars advertised were Piper, doing a version of Piper's Pit, Curt Hennig, Bagwell, Vampiro, the Nasty Boys, the Road Warriors, Duggan, and Valentine, most of which had signed 45-day contracts prior to the TV tapings. So they would be perfect shows for anyone who was a fan of late 80s/early 90s WWE or the dying days of WCW then. Now, there was skepticism from people in the business that this was even going to work, but the financial backers were operating under the assumption that the house shows were a loss leader that could create a bit of buzz heading into the National Association of Television Program Executives Convention in Las Vegas in January. There, they hoped to sell their edited TV show to a domestic buyer. So how did the XWF's 3-day jaunt to the Midwest turn out? Well, business-wise, not so great. The opening night in Hammond drew around 3,000 people, around 2,000 of which paid, or 2/3 full, for a gate in the region of $50,000. Milwaukee drew about 3,500 and Green Bay 1,500, though all the shows were papered to some degree. These poor houses convinced the backers to cancel 3 more shows in Port Huron and Battle Creek, Michigan, and in Toledo, Ohio, scheduled for early January. In a press release, the XWF claimed that these cancellations were due to an unspecified quote-unquote TV company asking for them to keep all the footage for them, meaning that they couldn't use footage to run new infomercials to advertise these future shows. If you say so, XWF, I believe you. In a rare example, actually, of promoters looking after the talent, the wrestlers already booked for the January house shows were told that they would be paid for them regardless of the cancellation, so that's nice at least. As for the shows themselves, the ones that took place, they got off to a bit of a ropey start. On the first night, they began 30 minutes late due to a ticketing issue, and there was a Polaroid picture intermission featuring Stephanie Bellas, formerly known as Gorgeous George, Nitro Girl Chiquita, and Leah Meow, and that intermission ran for 50 minutes. So with the show running long, many people left before the main event 3-way between Bagwell, Hennig, and Vampiro. But the other 2 shows ran a lot more smoothly, and they even recorded the one from Milwaukee to potentially use footage from it in future infomercials designed to promote upcoming house shows. But would there be any future shows for the XWF? Even though the first batch of house shows were run as something of an experiment to see if the whole infomercial thing would work, and it kind of clearly didn't, the poor attendances and woeful advances for the cancelled early January dates had to be quite discouraging. XWF executives Flood and Denny did have a meeting with the Clear Channel in New York in early January, but nothing was planned until after that convention in Las Vegas on January 21st. The promotion was then dealt a blow when WWE announced that Curt Hennig, as Mr. Perfect, would be returning as an entrant in the 2002 Royal Rumble match on January 20th, in what was a supposed one-shot deal. Hennig was planned to be at the convention the day after, and the inside word was that the XWF intended to actually make him their world champion and the star that they would build everything around now that Hogan wasn't a full-time part of the thing. But Hennig wasn't signed to an XWF contract because almost nobody was, and if he got a good reaction at the Rumble, and if he looked anything like his old talented self, there was always the chance that WWE would just snap him up to spite this new promotion. XWF officials tried to paint a rosy picture publicly because their, or quote-unquote their star, was going to be in one of WWE's biggest matches of the year. But then, when Hennig got a very hearty response and put in a decent performance and made it to the Rumble's Final 4, WWE did end up offering him a deal. So rather than flying to Vegas and representing the XWF at the convention, the former IC champion instead went to the Raw TV taping in South Carolina to negotiate his WWE contract. Hennig signing with WWE helped contribute to a morale change for the worse in the XWF, as far as those who were banking on it being a success were concerned anyway. Hogan not signing, and then also negotiating to return to WWE, and Sting's disinterest now that he was a free agent, also contributed to this feeling of doom and gloom. The wrestlers being told that a deal with FX would be announced imminently didn't really do much to raise spirits because that sort of talk had been happening even since before the November television tapings. XWF still tried to put on a brave face at the convention, even though attendance at the convention was down from the previous year. They spent $150,000 on their presentation and brought in the likes of Roddy Piper and Rena Miro. They also brought a ring with them with the intention of running some matches, but they couldn't get a license in time, which resulted in Kid Cash and Vampiro losing a booking. And the convention attendees losing a banger, am I right, guys? No, seriously, I was a huge Vampiro fan back then. What a guy. There were more talks with the foreign stations than the domestic ones at the convention, but in the weeks after, a bunch of rumors sprang up regarding a possible TV destination for the XWF. Jimmy Hart had held meetings with Turner Broadcasting, who he was friendly with, but remember Jamie Kellner, the guy whose first major move as the head of Turner was to axe wrestling from its schedule, the death of WCW? Well, there was a belief that he wasn't going to really greenlight wrestling's return, was he? In these uncertain times, the XWF ran 3 more house shows in Amarillo, Texas, and Lubbock, Texas, and Hobbs, New Mexico, between February 22nd and 24th. But unfortunately, these would be the last shows the XWF would ever run. As with the first trio of house shows, these 3 were a money loser for the promoters. Amarillo attracted 2,300 fans, Lubbock 1,300, and Hobbs 1,600, with the latter 2 drawing a predominantly Latino crowd. Therefore, Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr., who wrestled the Nasty Boys, were described as being like the stars of the show. But at this point, it was believed that investors had already lost around $2 million or so. House shows scheduled for Michigan and Ohio at the end of March were cancelled, but wrestlers were told to sit tight because there was, yet again, talk about a possible TV deal in the offing, but again, nothing concrete. In early April, the XWF announced a 4-show tour of sold house shows to take place in Texas. These were being bought by a Dallas-based company called Ring Entertainment, who promoted events on or near college campuses. The shows were bookmarked for April 24th, 25th, 26th, and 27th in San Marcos, Tyler, Belton, and Waco. The XWF would receive $80,000 for the 4 shows, with a $40,000 deposit paid up front. In what can never be construed as a good sign, the wrestlers booked for the tour were asked to work for less than their usual fee as a show of good faith to promoter Walter Frank. And in what can always be construed as a terrible sign, the entire tour was cancelled at the last minute when Ring Entertainment pulled out. The company had been in charge of all expenses and advertising and had only requested that Dusty Rhodes, booked against Greg Valentine in the only announced match, be on the shows. When Brian Knobbs flew in a day before the first show for a meeting with the local promoter, everything seemed on the up, but they never showed up the day after and suddenly cancelled the tour. Knobbs, who was doubtless worried about the reputational damage to the XWF brand, offered all the arenas the chance to do either full shows or autograph sessions as kind of a make good. But only the arena in San Marcos agreed to host an autograph session, and a few hundred fans turned up to meet talent who were no doubt quite annoyed at this latest turn of events. It turns out there had hardly been any advertising in any of the markets, and advance ticket sales for all 4 shows were pitiful. In Tyler, for example, only 50 tickets had been sold for a show advertising the likes of Roddy Piper and Rena Miro. Luckily for the wrestlers though, the $40,000 advance covered their flights and fees for the 4 shows, and a check would be mailed to them later, and as a bonus, they got to fly back home after just the first night. There was talk of running more dates in June, but that talk quickly evaporated, while on the TV deal front, wrestlers were again told to expect an announcement imminently, with FX or Fox Kids the rumoured destination. Turner, on the other hand, was a non-starter. In June, the talk turned to the XWF actually buying a 5-week TV run using the tapes from the initial batch of tapings in the hopes they could pop a rating and leverage that into a house show run or attracting a proper TV deal. Of course, once you're known as paid programming in the industry, it's hard to shake that tag and have networks view you as anything else. The tentative plan, according to reports, was to do a 5-week run in September and October, likely on the WGN network in Chicago, and build towards an October pay-per-view. An issue would be that a big chunk of talent on the TV show, namely Hulk Hogan, wouldn't be on whatever pay-per-view they could put out. Any other name-value talent they might want to use may also opt to work instead for this newly created NWA TNA promotion instead. Now, NWA TNA was still an unknown, and many within the industry didn't believe it would survive to see the end of the year, but it was still definitely something the XWF had to factor in. For all the talk of getting a TV deal or running a pay-per-view or even just becoming a touring company, the stark reality was for the XWF, since November, all they had to show for their efforts was 10 outdated episodes of television and a couple of badly attended house show loops. After a long meeting on June 26, 2002, XWF backers and management concluded that there was no way to do business in the United States. There just wasn't any interest from the networks, and they didn't really fancy spending $330,000 to get their show on a local station in Chicago. The people controlling the purse strings were going to cut their losses after putting in millions of dollars for no return. The company wouldn't shut down completely, but the office employees, yes, there had been people working in the XWF office this entire time, well, they were being let go. Wrestlers who were either on a retainer or a low downside guarantee were also informed that they were no longer under contract. There was still a slim hope that they could sell the tapes abroad and then maybe put an international tour together, but it was very evident by this point that they weren't going to be an alternative to WWE in the United States. One place the XWF could do some business, or at least keep their name alive, was Puerto Rico, with Jimmy Hart striking a deal with the World Wrestling Council, who had been attached to the XWF from the start, to run kind of an invasion storyline in the promotion, with the likes of Kid Cash and the Nasty Boys defending their XWF Cruiserweight and Tag Team titles there. Yes, there were belts. The promotion had championships, guys. It was planned to be a long-term deal, but didn't do good business at the box office and culminated in an XWF versus WWC show on October 20th, which drew around 3,000 people. After that, the XWF just sort of seemed to fizzle out. The excitement was gone, the big stars were gone, and there were new alternatives such as TNA and even Ring of Honor now for fans to get into. The only thing to do now was to try and monetize whatever XWF content they had, which began with a 1-hour reduced price pay-per-view called XWF In Your Face, which aired on March 16th, 2003. Finally, the world would get to see Hale take on Marty Jannetty. A little bit over a year later, it was reported that Jimmy Hart was purchasing whatever was left of the XWF, most significantly, the rights to the tapes. Later that year, the talk was that Hart was hoping to resurrect the promotion with a focus on the European market. He even flew to England to do promotional work ahead of XWF's debut on the Wrestling Channel. And yes, here in the UK, we did have our own Wrestling Channel, which was mad. It showed everything from like old New Japan and Memphis to contemporary Noah and TNA. Honestly, it was glorious. Jimmy Hart continued to work on trying to make a dime off the XWF with a 3-disc DVD featuring the lost episodes of the XWF, which was released on July 10th, 2005. The main selling point of this was the Hulk Hogan vs. Kurt Hennig match, and naturally, the Hulkster got a nice cut of the DVD sales. Sometimes you just have to take your hat off to a guy and say, what a worker, you know? The match was also included on WWE's 2006 3-disc DVD set, Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Anthology, with them presumably, licensing the footage as a favor to Jimmy Hart. That seems to be the case anyway. So, was that the end of the XWF then? A footnote in wrestling history with only one match of any real note to show for their efforts? Amazingly, no. Well, kind of not anyway. In late 2008, Jimmy Hart relaunched the XWF website with some new branding, prompting speculation that the promotion could be coming back. But speculation was all it turned out to be. There will be no return of the XWF. It was a promotion that arrived with a lot of hype and promise, and at various points seemed poised to become an alternative for the wrestlers as much as the wrestling fans. But the harsh reality of trying to start up a national company from scratch during uncertain times in the industry put them down for the 3 count. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack from Cultaholic Wrestling, and that was the true story of the XWF.